Your eyes on the times, you walk ready to speak up. But with so many problems, you're exhausted trying to keep up.
This is the Church Politics Podcast, where you can get political commentary from a biblical worldview. We're not trying to be conservative or progressive. We're trying to be Christian in the public square.
And I'm black as heaven. I'm made in God's image. Nobody can change my settings. Hey man, cut off my knees and put it into my search. It's easy to sell your soul when you don't know what it's worth.
What you know, good and camp. You're listening to the And Campaign's Church Politics Podcast with Justin Giboney, a.k.a. Bishop Cooper's grandson, and the Windy City representative, the baddest brother above the Mason-Dixon line, my play cousin, the Right Reverend Christopher Butler. How's it going, Chris, man? It's been a while since we've been on here together, but it's always good to be back, man. What's going on?
Yes, indeed. It is a beautiful beginning to the day. It's my oldest son, Corbin's birthday. So off to a lovely start.
Awesome. Well, happy birthday, young Butler. Chris, there's something that's been really on my mind, and I think I would be remiss not to talk about it, even though it's somewhat of a touchy subject. As you know, a good portion of our audience either lives in Los Angeles or are just fans of the team that plays basketball in Los Angeles.
Go Clippers.
Yeah, the other team in Los Angeles. And I think a sad and pitiful thing just happened a couple of days ago in regard to said team. Now, this is a team who, 4 years ago wins a championship in a bubble that nobody cares about. Earlier this season wins an in-season tournament, raises banners for it and all this other stuff. Nobody cares about it. But the sad thing about it is that they keep getting in situations where they get gassed up to think they have a chance, but they never really have a chance. They never really were going to get to the championship this year or ever get another championship as long as they have this team. But you see their fans get gassed up and have these small wins that end up really just bringing them down even lower. So I want to say to everybody in Los Angeles, everybody that's a fan of that team, my heart is with you. If you need a shoulder to cry on, I'm here. And I also like to tell you I told you so. Not to be self-righteous or anything like that, or, not to step out of my normal humility, but I told you so. This team was not going to have any success. As been said, they wasn't going to go platinum. And it's about time that I think you would be in a better place right now if you didn't allow people who are lesser friends to gas you up to think that you could do more than what you did this season. Any comments on that, Chris?
Man, all good things come to an end. And I suppose they maybe had a good thing in LA for a season or two, at least a modified season. Or two, but it's time to move on, man. It's time to move on.
It's time to move on, man. The show has been over, but hopefully you guys regroup and stop talking this GOAT stuff. And if you do that, I think you might actually be blessed. So we'll see what happens, man. But that we're always with you, LA fans. But I guess it's time to move on. I want to give a shout out, as always, to our patrons and to our supporters for supporting us in what we do and how we do it. As you guys know, we touch on a lot of subjects that you're not going to hear on other podcasts, and we wouldn't be able to do that unless we had independent support. And so we appreciate all the support that we get. If you want to become a patron, you can go to patreon.com/churchpolitics. And if you give every month, you will get premium episodes. So after we record this, we're recording another episode, and our premium members are able to listen to that episode. All right. Also, if you're watching on YouTube, make sure that you like and subscribe so we can get into this algorithm, man. We're trying to figure out this YouTube algorithm, and we need your help to do it. So as always, you know what it is. Grab your Bible, get your mind right, and prepare to think. Not like a Republican, not like a Democrat, but to think like a Christian. And I want to go into a pretty serious subject right now, Chris. And I want to start it off with Psalm 1, verse 1. And it says, well, part of verse 1, okay? It says, blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked. Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked. Other versions say something like, blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked. The man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked. Chris, you know that around 2014, the Flint water crisis became a major national news story. It was discovered that Flint residents had been exposed to lead poison water, and it was having some major consequences for them. Many of us have heard of this issue, but I'm not sure that we know exactly what happened. And many of us assume, like I have, that the problem was fixed, that everything that they were dealing with was past. Well, I hate to bring the bad news to you that this is not past. This hasn't been fixed, and people are still suffering because of it. Now, Chris and I recently watched a new documentary entitled Flint Fatigue that I can say opened my eyes to a number of factors that I just was not aware of, Chris. And I would recommend that everybody listening to this would go watch that documentary. You can see it on YouTube. It's called Flint Fatigue. But I want to kind of give you an overview of the history here and what happened, because this is stuff that I didn't really realize. Okay. So it starts with the fact that for decades, Flint, Michigan paid the city of Detroit to send them water through the Detroit pipeline. The relationship, as far as I can tell, and based on the documentary, was fairly uneventful, other than the fact that Detroit was trying to raise its fee around that 2014 period. During this time, though, Flint was in a very bad financial situation, very bad financial condition, and they didn't want to pay what Detroit was asking for. And there was basically, because of this, at some point, Flint was taken over from a financial standpoint by the state. There was a state takeover of their finances. And so Flint was very limited in what they could do without the approval of the state government. Now, during this time, Michigan's governor was Rick Snyder, who was a Republican, and he had selected emergency managers to oversee Flint. These unelected managers could override elected officials in the area and make financial decisions for Flint without any sort of democratic process. And from what I gathered from the documentary, they could also almost remove local elected officials, if I'm not mistaken. The emergency managers, or czars as some in the documentary were calling them, and others came up with the idea that instead of paying the fees that Detroit wanted, they had the idea to build and join what they were calling the KWA pipeline. And that would be an alternative to renewing their agreement with Detroit. In this agreement, Flint would have to pay about $100 million of the $300 million it was going to take to finish the pipeline in a sort of public-private partnership. Okay. The problem was, the KWA pipeline wasn't ready by the time that Flint stopped receiving water from Detroit. So they decided to get their water during this period between not getting water from Detroit to getting water from the KWA, this transition period. They decided to get their water from the Flint River and to treat that river water at an old, out-of-date treatment facility in Flint that hadn't been used in years. It was not ready to actually treat the water in the way that it needed to be treated. After a while, it was clear that the water was having a terrible impact on the people of Flint. But the government, even through everything that they were seeing and that was being reported, the government maintained that the water was fine. Finally, there was a whistleblower from Governor Snyder's office. I think she was in his legal office, that came out and said it very clearly. Flint needs to switch back to the Detroit pipeline because of contamination in the Flint River. This contamination was basically cancer-causing agents that these people were drinking and bathing in on a daily basis. But we have these emergency managers who pushed back. They said it was too expensive to switch back to Detroit. Now, when you say something's expensive, that's relative, right?
Yeah.
So if something's too expensive, okay, relative to the alternative, what's the alternative? Having people drink water with cancer-causing agents in it? Too expensive? That's ridiculous. Now, it is worth noting, I think, that Detroit had offered to cut its rate that it had initially offered by 48% before these emergency managers decided to switch to the Flint River. Now, if they were going to cut it that low and money was the issue, then why didn't Flint say, okay, good deal, let's just move forward? Well, some are suggesting that corporations had entered into the conversation and basically privatizing the water system had become something that a bunch of companies wanted to do and were going to make money off of, which changed the calculus for some of these Flint emergency managers. All right. And so they were like, yeah, even though you're lowering it more and it'd probably be cost us less money, we're going to go ahead with the KWA anyway. Now, once this happened, some would say that this was part of Detroit going bankrupt because Flint was basically its biggest customer. They got a lot of money from Flint from sending the water to them. All right. Now, emails show that the governor and the emergency managers had been warned over and over and over again about how unclean the water was. But still they did and said nothing. And check this out. This is the bad part. They even went so far as to flush out the river before it was tested for contamination so that the test would not show the regular levels of contamination. They were hiding it. This is criminal. Moving to KWA was basically privatizing everything. You have these corporate interests involved. And even when the governor and his people learn that this is contaminated, and it's clear that they were told that over again, and you even had a whistleblower, they keep moving on with KWA, even though they got a better offer from Detroit. Meanwhile, stomach, throat, and brain cancer in Flint rises 300%. Children as young as 8 years old were being diagnosed with things like breast cancer. Fertility rates decreased by 12%. Depression and suicide went up, and children were having their growth stunted. But somebody has to get to the money bag. And today, Flint residents pay some of the highest water rates in the country, even though the water is coming from old pipes and it's still making people sick. People are getting liens on their property and losing their homes if they cannot pay for dirty water. The state never made sure the necessary upgrades were made to the treatment facility. Funds that were supposed to go to water infrastructure were diverted to other purposes. I want you to chew on that for a little bit. Those who ran the state government at the time, Governor Snyder and company, should not only be ashamed of themselves, Chris. In my opinion, they should be in jail for life. They hid contamination that was killing people. Oh, but guess what happened? You might say, well, are they being prosecuted? Well, they were, but a judge recently drops all the charges. And then get this. The current governor, Gretchen Whitmer, who's a Democrat, basically ran against the Republican Party in part on a promise to fix the Flint situation. However, and this comes from Flint's mayor at the time, when Flint's mayor at the time asked her for help, this is what Whitmer said. The people of Michigan have Flint fatigue. meaning they don't want to hear about it. There's not the will to help you, even though I ran on this, even though people are suffering and dying every day. I'm going to pass it to you, Chris, but I just want to say this. We know places in America where this would never be allowed to happen. Where if it did happen even for a week, there would be hell to pay. But because Flint is made up of poor black and white people, their justice is deferred. In so many ways, in my opinion, Chris, this is a miscarriage of democracy, and few mainstream outlets will report on it, and that's why people don't even know that the problem hasn't been fixed. Go ahead, Chris.
So I want to just say thank you for that really good overview of the history. And I'd certainly recommend that folks go and look at the documentary, because it is one of these issues that, you know, I felt almost convicted just in watching the documentary, because it's one of those things that simply never got solved and just kind of went away and fell out of the limelight. And I'm grateful for this documentary, because it raises an issue again. And I'll step back and say, like, I struggle with that piece because I felt convicted while I was watching it. I also am one of the people who is constantly cautioning that we can't be hyper engaged in every issue everywhere all the time. But I'm really, really grateful for this, because I remember the feeling of a lot of people here. So circa 2015, 2016, as the Flint crisis was so-called wrapping up, the church that I lead now and was very much involved in that time, we were actually in the Inglewood community in Chicago, which is a community that had a lot of lead in the pipes in Chicago for a long time. And one of the organizations that we work closely with, like, this was their main issue. And I remember some of those leaders in 2016. And, you know, as much as I love the documentary, I will say I wish they would have treated this part. They would have given a treatment to this part of the conversation. But in 2016, Barack Obama goes to Flint, very publicly drinks the water to suggest that the Flint water is clean, that it's safe. And this is because they had switched back to Detroit, right, which was a good thing. But what those advocates who were steeped in this lead issue, even then, what they were saying is, even if they switched back to Detroit, if they just had for 5 years this super contaminated water running through the pipes, they got to replace everything. That means that you got to replace the mains, you have to replace the delivery lines, you got to replace the internal plumbing in the homes. Otherwise, you're going to have that buildup in the pipes, and it's going to continue to make people sick for literally decades to come. And people who knew anything about lead all the way back then understood that. So it's not like this was not knowable. And I had to imagine that if you were president of the United States and a president of the United States who had been an organizer on the south side of Chicago, you had people around you where you could have accessed the knowledge that simply switching the source back to Detroit after years of having the contaminated water running through the pipes was not actually a solution. And so it was in 2016 disingenuous and misleading to suggest that the crisis had been solved and that the water was safe, because it wasn't then, just as it isn't now. And that played a major role. If there is a Flint fatigue, that plays a role in creating Flint fatigue, because if the problem is solved, then why are you continuing to complain? So today, what you have in Flint, they switched back in 2016 to Detroit. I did find it. We were talking about it just before we started recording. They did finish the KWA pipeline in 2020. And I think in 2021, they switched to that source. But if you have clean water running through dirty pipes, and the only thing that they ever did fix in Flint. They fixed the delivery lines. They didn't fix the water mains, and they did not do the internal plumbing in the vast majority of the houses. So most of the piping is still very, very contaminated, and that's why people continue to get sick.
And to be
so,
clear, that's what the mayor was asking Whitmer about when are they going to help them change the pipes under people's houses. And Whitmer says people have Flint fatigue.
Yeah. So we just can't access that money, even though that's literally what I ran on to defeat the Republican. And it's just really sad because it speaks to that whole dynamic of, in today's politics, we want to bifurcate everything and make everything either, like it's all the Republicans' fault, it's all the Democrats' fault. And this is such a, I don't know. I mean, you have Democrats, you have Republicans, you have corporations, all like involved in this cabal. Where, as the mayor says very well in the documentary, the former mayor of Flint, the only people who really pay for it ultimately are the people of Flint. Nobody gets prosecuted. None of these corporations have to, give back any of the money that they're making from privatizing the water. None of the politicians get prosecuted. Governor Whitmer is having her name tossed around as like a 2028 presidential candidate, and it's just really sad. And it goes to show that you cannot bring that sort of neat and comfortable binary to almost any issue, especially not these significant issues that are playing out in a lot of places in the country.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a worse scandal. One of the people on the documentary mentioned that this is worse than Watergate.
Yeah.
Right, because initially they were going to call it Watergate, but Watergate was already taken from when Nixon, bugged one of the Democrat, buildings. But I mean, that was bad.
Yeah.
But this has actually killed people. This is actually having effects that we can't even put our finger on exactly, that we don't even know yet. And it's still going on. And when they were interviewing that young mother in Flint who knew the water was bad, but still had to drink the water out of the faucet every now and then because she didn't have an option, and she was showing the sores and all that stuff on her daughter, it was heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And yet and still, we have Christians who will defend anything the Republican or Democratic Party as constituted today does. They'll defend anything they do as if they've been the savior, as if either side has been the saviors of this country. How in the world does the federal government, I don't care if it's a Democratic administration or Republican administration, it's been through both, Flint has seen both, how do they not come in and make sure this is changed? It's the same thing that happened in East Palestine when a certain type of people is impacted like this. It doesn't matter. We'll say what we got to say. We'll go visit just so you don't blame us for it, but we never fix it. How in the world does the federal government with money to do all these other things we're doing and send all type of money across seas not fix what's going on in Flint after 10 years? Yeah. That is corrupt. Those are terrible priorities. And anybody who's defending these people right now really needs to check themselves, because this is third world stuff, and it's stuff that doesn't have to happen, but we don't put the least of these first. Yeah. And that's really what this is about.
Yeah, it totally is. And I do want to highlight the healthcare sort of angle and issue here as well, because there is precedent in these United States for when a community goes through this type of ecological crisis, that community gets access for a certain number of years, usually a lot of years, to universal health care. So basically Medicare for all the people who were in that community. Flint never got that. Didn't get it under the Obama administration, didn't get it under the Trump administration, hadn't gotten it under the Biden administration. So
and
again,
there were other places that got it under the Obama administration. Am I not correct?
Yeah, under the Obama administration.
It's part of Obamacare, right?
Yeah, but it has not been that has not been granted. to folks in Flint. So you got the folks who were being poisoned. That part was not even in question anymore. They were being poisoned for a number of years. They don't have access to health care. So many of those folks have died. It was really just heart wrenching listening to some of the folks in there. There was one mother in the documentary who was talking about her sons who were preteen. One was a preteen and one was a teenager when the first switch happened, and just describing how they were regular kids before that water switch, how she saw their behavior start to change after the water switch, and now one of them is like completely depressed and one is incarcerated. And to know that those things are happening in those families, but you don't have access to the health coverage to make sure that those kids are getting the medical care that they need, because they have all these contaminants and lead in their system, and they're not getting the mental health coverage and care that they need. As we know, like a lot of research has established that these types of contaminants, especially lead, lead to these mental health challenges, but there's no mental health care. There's no medical health care. It is criminal conspiracy at its highest level, and I'm glad that they made this documentary. I hope that it makes its way around, and that this becomes an issue in our politics right now. I can't help but make the comparison because of the time that we are in. How there is a massive protest movement happening right now because of literal crimes being committed against children in Gaza and innocent families. We cannot be up in arms about that and don't care about literal crimes that are being committed against innocent women and children in Flint, Michigan, right here in the United States,
where justice is being denied on a number of accounts, not only in the money that was supposed to go to fix the infrastructure being diverted and nobody going to jail for that, but people literally hiding the contaminant. Bro, Pookie goes to jail for writing a bad check.
Yeah.
These folks can hide contamination, exposing thousands and thousands of people to cancer-causing agents, and there's a judge that drops the charges. That is corruption at its worst. That is complete corruption. So, look, I think one of the lessons that comes out of this is we cannot be fatigued. We like to talk about the hot issue for a couple weeks, for a couple months, post on Instagram, do all that other stuff, and then forget about it. But the true issues you have to stay on, because guess what? There are some people in power who will just wait it out.
Yeah.
Who have friends in the media that'll let them not be held accountable and just wait it out so that you don't do anything. So if you truly care about advocacy and you think that you can change the world in a year, 2 years, 5 years, no, there's some issues you're going to have to stay on and that you're going to have to really hold people accountable for. All right. We'll be right back on the Church Politics Podcast.
Your eyes on the times, you walk ready to speak up. But with so many problems, you're exhausted trying to keep up.
This is the Church Politics Podcast, where you can get political commentary from a biblical worldview. We're not trying to be conservative or progressive. We're trying to be Christian in the public square.
And I'm black as heaven. I'm made in God's image. Nobody can change my settings. Hey man, got off my knees and put an end to my search. It's easy to sell your soul when you don't know what it's worth.
And we are back on the Church Politics Podcast with Justin Giboney and the Right Reverend Christopher Butler. I want to go back to scripture, if you don't mind, Chris. And I want to read from Genesis 21:6, which says, Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. Sarah, of course, is talking about the birth of Isaac in her old age. But I just want to remind us, because I think some of you all need reminding, that laughter is good. And we should all not only laugh frequently, but we should all be able to laugh at ourselves sometimes. That's one of the, I'll be honest with you, Chris, when I finally learned that, to be able to laugh at myself is one of the best lessons that I've ever learned. I think, number one, it shows humility. It shows we're not taking ourselves too seriously. And it also shows that we're trying to avoid. I think it keeps us away from a type of self-righteousness. Don't take yourself too seriously, even if sometimes you're dealing with serious matters. And I'll be honest with you, Chris, that's one of the reasons that I like to start this show off with levity. Yeah. Even though we're talking about serious issues, I think there needs to be a certain levity brought to it to help us put things in perspective and understand that God's on the throne. So there's always room for laughter, and there's always room to look at the good side of things and the funny side of things. Mm-hmm. But a comedian who some of you, I'm guessing, have heard of, Jerry Seinfeld, had a few words to say about the state of comedy today, the state of our sense of humor. Go ahead and play that, Slew.
Nothing really affects comedy. People always need it. They need it so badly, and they don't get it. It used to be you would go home at the end of the day. Most people would go, oh, Cheers is on. Oh, MASH is on. Oh, Mary Tyler Moore is on. All in the Family's on. You just expected there'll be some funny stuff we can watch on TV tonight. Well, guess what? Where is it? This is the result of the extreme left and PC crap and people worrying so much about offending other people. Mm-hmm. When you write a script and it goes into 4 or 5 different hands, committees, groups, here's our thought about this joke, well, that's the end of your comedy. They move the gates, like in skiing. Yeah. Culture, the gates are moving. Your job is to be agile and clever enough that wherever they put the gates, I'm going to make the gate.
Chris, I think Seinfeld had a point. You know, me and my wife, we watch old shows, and we realized that half of the stuff they used to say back when we were kind of growing up, mm-hmm. they could never get away with saying today. And I don't know that it's for a good reason in a lot of cases. Like, we watch shows like Martin, or even when you see shows like The Simpsons or In Living Color, those shows made fun of everyone, right? And when they made fun of everyone, it wasn't, until the end, until later on, people weren't worried about the racial insensitivity and all that stuff. I think we can be overly worried about people cracking a joke. But today, man, you can hardly get away with anything. And I think a lot of shows today are just limited by political correctness. They're limited because people don't want to offend others. Or I should say they at least don't want to offend certain types of people. You can offend, the more conservative elements in society. But outside of that, you got to be very cautious with what you say. And I think some of y'all, again, just need to laugh. Like, some of us are so into our advocacy, whether it's justice advocacy or sanctity of life advocacy, that I'm not sure that we laugh anymore, that every time we say something public, it's got to be super serious, and everybody's got to be hypersensitive and always defending themselves. Now, I could have swore, Chris, that the Bible said, be slow to take offense. And if we're slow to take offense, I think we'll look at some of these things differently. But what were your thoughts about what Jerry Seinfeld had to say about the state of our sense of humor?
Yeah, and I think that Seinfeld is right on. I don't know if we've talked about it before on the podcast. I know that we've talked about it before. Just this idea that there's so much political correctness, if that's the right term for it, that it's hard to be funny, because a lot of what makes funny is that it comes after everybody, right? So I was at the Exiles in Babylon conference a few weeks ago. They actually, and we had this conversation about 3 different approaches to politics. We're talking about kind of conservative approach, progressive approach, and kind of an Anabaptist disengagement approach. And then after that, they had a comedian come up, and he kind of came at all of us, right? Like, and that's what makes it funny, right? Is that you're able to do that. And when you're not able to do that, it's hard to be funny. And so I thought Seinfeld was onto something. I probably am going to go against our own advice here, because I am taking issue with this critique that I've seen in more than one place now of Seinfeld's commentary, where they're basically trying to paint Seinfeld as like this racist, bigoted person because of this statement, and particularly, because of the shows that he actually names by name, are shows that are all, they're predominantly white cast. I would personally argue, and I'm not here to defend Jerry Seinfeld, cards on the table. I did think the Seinfeld show was kind of funny, but I'm not here to defend him or his commentary, or at least not his bigot or not bigot. I don't know Jerry Seinfeld enough to say that. But this particular criticism, to automatically call him a bigot, is frustrating me because, number one, it is historically inaccurate, right?
Right.
If this is like, well, Jerry Seinfeld don't want to see black and brown people on television, the critique is like 25, 30 years too late, right? Because we can talk about the shows that we grew up watching, and you already mentioned some of the shows that I was going to mention, like Martin, like And Live in Color. We grew up watching those shows. They were funny. They were edgy. They were not all white. So if Seinfeld had like a huge problem with black people being on TV, this is like 25, 30 years too late. I think that what really is happening here is something that frustrates me in our discourse all the time, because it takes like years and years of like hard work and blood and sacrifice that has been expended to actually push for black inclusion and black representation, which actually did begin to emerge in the 90s and early 2000s. And as it began to emerge, that whole thing got co-opted and conflated with this broader sort of, I guess I would call it, social progressive agenda. And so it seems like to me that what Seinfeld is commenting on, especially if you listen beyond the clip that has gone viral that we played, if you listen to the fuller conversation, it becomes pretty clear that Seinfeld is not talking about black and brown people being on television. He's talking about this broader set of progressive political correctness, where you can't make fun of homosexual people, queer people, gender nonconforming people, trans people. Like, there's a whole lot of issues that get piled up on top of that. And my thing is that when you conflate these two movements and these two issues, it actually does sort of dishonor, devalue, and mischaracterize decades of work to work for like the civil rights and the social and economic advancement of black people and brown people in this country. And I think that the conflation of those two things, it frustrates me, and I'm seeing it more and more. And maybe I'm just a little triggered, Justin, by the critique coming after Seinfeld here. But I'm looking at the fact that you can be like both in support of the idea of like pro-black, anti-racist struggle, and you can be in support of a comprehensive, progressive social agenda that includes like LGBTQ and all that stuff. You can support both of those things, but at least have the intellectual honesty to acknowledge that they are not the same thing. Because my grandmother, who is still alive, healthy, take the bus and all that stuff, I talk to her like at least once a week, and she was born literally in a world where it was illegal for her to go to certain schools, eat in certain restaurants, drink from certain water fountains, to cast a vote, to buy a house in a certain locations. And we're talking about illegal, not socially unacceptable or sort of outside of the norm. It was prohibited by formal laws and regulations. And so that is a distinction that I think we allow too easily to slip into the background and be overlooked. So anytime I see people conflating the issue of kind of like pro-black struggle, anti-racist struggle, and this broader set of sort of left-wing ideas, I get kind of frustrated with that. So so I don't know if Jerry Seinfeld is a racist. I don't know if he's a bigot, but you can't just conflate those two and make him that, because to be opposed to this broader set of left-wing issues is not the same as being racist. It can't be allowed to be that.
Let me say this. There are certainly jokes that are distasteful or malicious, right? The problem that I see is that category has been widened to cover so much area that certain people just never can take a joke, never get a joke. I would go so far as I think everybody is, when it comes to comedy, I don't think you censor comedians. I think everybody can get it when it comes to comedy, right? Yep. I really do. And I think a lot of y'all would be better off if you listen to some comedy that expose some of your idiosyncrasies or just the trash culture within your culture. Yep. Every culture, white, black, straight, every culture has some stuff in it that needs to get made fun of. And sometimes that's the only time that you get the point. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? Like sometimes it's your, oh yeah, we probably shouldn't do that. Right. I think everybody can get it. And I think folks need to stop being too sensitive. That doesn't mean there's no line to be drawn. But what the left tends to do in these circumstances is draw the line so broadly that you cut off a comedian from actually being a comedian. And the only people you get to make fun of is traditional conservatives. Outside of that, oh, everybody else is too sensitive, and you're some type of phobic if you make fun of them. I don't think you don't want a society without the comedians, real comedians. I'm not talking about these folks who are completely politically correct and they're basically just going off the talking points that they get from activists and academics, right? Yeah. What's supposed to be funny? Let me stay in this zone and make jokes about that. That's weak. That's lame. Nobody wants to hear it. One thing that my friend Pastor Watley mentioned to me, and I think it's been said by others too, is today it seems like the comedians are the prophets in some sense. Mm-hmm. You have a lot of Christians who on one side either have no credibility to make some of these social critiques, this social commentary. You have people on the left who are so hypersensitive and so politically correct that they won't make the critique. And all you have left is a few brave comedians that just gonna say what needs to be said. Yeah. And again, the thing about comedy, you can't come at somebody else unless you're ready to take it as well. Yeah. Right? Don't dish it if you can't take it. But some of y'all like to laugh at other people, but don't dare anybody. Nobody can say a joke about me. The other part that I think we just can't handle is truth. And what comedy brings is satirical truths sometimes. The best comedians bring satirical truths. And some of those truths we just can't stomach, and so we don't want to hear it.
Yeah. And I think we just let this like political issues creep into too many domains. Because I know a number of people who actually do comedy, write comedy, tell the story some other time. But I thought that like I would be much closer to that world in my professional career. There was a point in my life when I thought that. And a lot of times comedians are not coming from the place of a political agenda, right? Like the gift, the art of making comedy is simply the art of observation. Absolutely. Right? A lot of folks they're not coming from a political agenda. They're observing the world and society, and they see something that's funny and they want to make the joke. And there's been a number of times where you actually paint people into like this political space that like, if you actually observe their political activity, they're not even really in that place. But as a comedian, they can look at even their own side of the political aisle, so to speak, and see where some stuff is, it's funny, and they observe it and they make the joke. So, that piece of it is also real, where we sometimes color comedy as too political, because oftentimes it's just not. It's just a comedian doing their thing.
Yeah, and I think some people want it to be political, but only political for their side. Yeah. And they want it only to help their ideology. And I think they put themselves in a place where all their comedians aren't going to be funny, but eventually they're just making the other side's comedians a lot more funny who don't have the same restraints. And I think we're starting to see that going on now. Yeah. But again, when it comes to comedy, I'm almost an absolutist. Like, do not censor the comedians. If there's a few that go too far, then they go too far, right? But we need comedy, and there's some things in our society that politics ain't going to fix, other things aren't going to fix. Comedy may be the only way. That levity that comes with comedy may be the only way to address it on a mass level, unfortunately. We'll be right back on the Church Politics Podcast.
Your eyes on the times, you walk ready to speak up. But with so many problems, you're exhausted trying to keep up.
This is the Church Politics Podcast, where you can get political commentary from a biblical worldview. We're not trying to be conservative or progressive. We're trying to be Christian in the public square.
And I'm black as heaven. I'm made in God's image. Nobody can change my settings. Hey man, got off my knees and put an end to my search. It's easy to sell your soul when you don't know what it's worth.
And we are back on the Church Politics Podcast. You know, Chris, there's been a lot of conversation, especially on the Democratic side, about saving democracy. And you know me, Chris, I'm very serious about the idea that democracy is worth saving. The American democracy is worth saving. I don't think people really understand how much worse this country could be if we did not have a democracy and the voice that it allows people to have, and just that process. We need it. And there are things that need to be fixed. There are things that we need to make sure that we reform. But democracy is worth saving. And so shout out to all those people who are putting work in to save democracy. But if we're going to save democracy, if we're going to say that's what we're trying to do, then we need to make sure that we're doing that impartially and that we're not picking and choosing what democracy threatening activities or behaviors we're attacking. And that came to mind to me as I was reading an article in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, which said this: with congressional incumbents David Scott and Lucy McBeth declining to participate, the challengers who showed up to the 6th and 13th district debates Sunday each tried to make the case that they would be the best alternative. So the two incumbents decided not to show up to the debate, and so the challengers spoke to the crowds by themselves. Scott is a Democrat from Atlanta. Sally McBeth is a Democrat from Marietta. I'm sorry, Lucy McBeth, excuse me, is a Democrat from Marietta, Georgia. And both are running for re-election in seats that, due to redistricting, look much different than their current territories. Still, name recognition and healthy campaign accounts will make them tough to beat, especially by mostly unknown challengers. This isn't personal. I don't have anything personal against Lucy McBeth and David Scott. I actually get to see them quite a bit when I fly back and forth to it from DC to Atlanta. But I want to say something to all incumbents in general. That seat does not belong to you. And every time an election comes up, you have to earn that seat. One of the ways that people can evaluate you and what you have done is through debates. It's through campaign debates where they can ask you questions, or where your opponent can ask you questions and find out what you're really about, what you've done in the last 2 years, what you haven't done in the last 2 years. Did you actually make good on those promises? If we really want to save democracy, not one party, especially right now the Democratic Party, which is making the issue out of this, and it is an issue, and I think Trump does make it an issue, so that's real. Mm-hmm. There needs to be a rule that you have to debate. And it's not only Lucy McBath and David Scott that aren't debating. There's incumbents all over the country that are refusing to debate, as if that seat belongs to them, as if it's a given that they should be back in it. Nobody, I don't care how long you've been in the seat, nobody should have that sort of attitude towards democracy and towards the voters. I think this is unfortunate. I think it contradicts a lot of what's coming from the party, and it needs to stop. And we saw it with Trump. Trump didn't debate during the primary. Biden didn't debate during the primary. And I just want to say those seats don't belong to you. There's no assumption. There should be no assumption that you're the right person to be back into it. Y'all need to debate. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah. I mean, this is quite clear to me. I mean, this is, if people know my kind of like background in advocacy and politics, this issue of like good government and campaigns is one of the things I've worked on a lot. And the biggest threat to democracy is not Donald Trump. the biggest threat to our democracy is the structural flaws that we have. And the sad part is incumbents in this moment refusing to debate is really just the incumbents saying the quiet part out loud, because what they're saying is, this person cannot beat me in this district. I got too much money. I have too much name recognition. The party is too much in control. I'm not going to lose. So I'm not going to waste my time debating. I'm not going to insult the people with this debate. And I absolutely think that there should be structural requirements for incumbents and challengers to participate in debates. But the structural things, if we want to lessen the power of incumbency so that incumbents would be more inclined to debate, we got to lessen the impact of money. We got to make sure that we are like doing what I call people first redistricting, and that we change the amount of control that two political parties that are not enshrined in our Constitution exercise over the primary process. And until we do these things, debate or not, those incumbents are going to feel like those seats belong to them. And that feeling is going to be grounded in a good deal of reality.
Yeah, it's going to be, I mean, that's the way that it looks. And at the end of the day, we need to realize, you know, I don't come from the point of view that either party is prioritizing upholding democracy, right? They may say it may be a good talking point, but that's not what they're trying to, parties are trying to win. Yeah. And we all need to be aware of that. Their priority is winning. It doesn't mean they don't care about democracy, but their priority is winning. So this really comes to the people, right? Like the people are the ones who vote. And if you just vote for the same people every time and not really thinking through it, then it's on us. So we get the representation we deserve. Yep. But it's time for us to start thinking through this and to hold people accountable who say they're about saving democracy, but then we see that it's not that's not their priority. Even when it comes to keeping third party, parties going around trying to keep third party campaigners off the ballot. Is that really about saving democracy? No, it's about winning. So don't come up to me talking about this party said they're about saving democracy. That party said they're about saving democracy. Of course, Chris knows that Trump, based off what he's done, can be a threat to democracy. Nobody's denying that. But these structural problems and the fact that the voters aren't taking hold and saying, hold up, you need to be there. Because they would be there if there was enough people saying, hey, you better be there. Yep. That's the problem, man. We got let's deal with what we can deal with. There may be monsters out there, but maybe one of the monsters is us. Yeah.
And perhaps this long-term structural issues has produced the monster and the monsters, because a lot of what gives you a Donald Trump is consternation with this complete disconnect between what our government does and what people want to actually take place. And, you know, it will take a ground up movement to change these things. At some point, in some way, people, everyday people, have to wrest away the power of our thinking and our voting behaviors from these big, powerful entities like parties and billionaires and all that stuff. Because at the end of the day, you don't have to vote for the person you see the ad for. You don't have to vote for the person who sends you the most mail. And we've got to figure out how to organize ourselves and pull back the power that we do have and use it to rebuild our democracy.
That's right. Well, and Camp, you know what it is. There's a cross that neither political conservatism nor progressivism is fit to bear. There's a civic hearing in need of faithful witnesses who love social justice and won't surrender the truth to be loved by the world. Politic with the boldness and compassion of Jesus Christ. Until next time, and Camp, we'll holler at you.